It is another treacherous night off the coast of Kinsale. Violent waves crash merchant ships onto rocky shores and deliver the means for plunder. Through this chaos and carnage, one realizes how cheap a life could be if it stood in the way of a case of silver or rum. Down on the southern coast, where the poor are barely surviving as is, it is more common for shipwrecked sailors to meet a more grisly end while their cargo mysteriously disappears. This cruel setting is where Anne Cormac was born, a woman who was brought up in secret, but soon would become the most famous woman in all of the Caribbean. Anne was born near the port town of Kinsale, close to the year of 1697. With her mother a lowly servant and her father an already married and highly reputed lawyer, she was born an illegitimate child.
Her mother is a housemaid and her father is a lawyer, so it's kind of children of both would have had very different lifestyles. You know, the child of one of the elite would have learned probably embroidery and how table manners, etiquette, and dined with, and spent time with other children of that ilk. Whereas the daughter of a normal servant woman or something would probably have been collecting seaweed on the strand and tending to stock and all that.
Her father, William, decided to keep her close, but in order to not rouse any suspicion, had her dressed as a boy with the new identity of a distant relative learning to be a clerk.
He had moved them into the house, but in order to cover for the fact that it was his child and she was a girl, he made her dress up as a boy, and he covered it by saying that he was training in a legal clerk to work with him. And she lived like that for quite a bit, a number of years. And as such, dressed as a boy, she would certainly have been able to gain access to areas on the quays and the wharves that probably females wouldn't have been. It wouldn't have been looked upon as proper, as it were.
At the time, life in Kinsale would not have been for the faint-hearted. Shipwrecks being raided and pillaged for their goods, smugglers stealing into the night with their ill-gotten gains, and Hangman's Point, a warning for all would-be criminals to change their ways or face justice at the short end of a rope.
She would have seen plenty of ships coming into the harbour. There's huge fleets would have arrived in, and at the time the harbour was deep enough, and the depth of the ships wasn't enough to prevent them using the harbour. So by her time, Kinsale is at its boom time, internationally.
So there you have Anne in the middle and Bonny in the middle of this. And I would say that her taste for getting as much as she possibly could in the marine setting started out there. In a way, it was her apprenticeship to an extremely exciting life, let's say, in future times.
It was not long before William's wife discovered the true identity of Anne, and in doing so, cut the funds to her upbringing. She would not pay for a bastard. As a form of revenge, William took to having the maid live at home with himself and Anne, much to the shock of his neighbours. This act, however, backfired, as the scandal had him lose out on clients. With no alternative, he decided to sell what possessions he could, travel with the maid and Anne to the city of Cork, and sail off to the Americas in hopes of a better life.
I think her father was rebellious by nature as well. He himself had an affair. He'd had a child out of wedlock. He refused to accept the community's opinion of him, and he left his home, he left everything. And so I think Annie's a product of her father. I think she actually did a lot of the way she lived her life, or the mistakes she made, was actually paralleling a lot of how he lived his life.
It was South Carolina that William decided to settle in. At first, he tried to restart his law career, but eventually found more success in merchandising and soon found himself with enough wealth to purchase a plantation. This new land was where Anne found herself growing into adulthood. Although her surroundings had calmed down, the wild spirit of Kinsale had never left her. She became rebellious and developed a fierce temper, with stories emerging that described a vicious character. One was of her stabbing a servant girl with a case knife, another telling of her revenge on a man who attempted to force himself upon her, and how she beat him to a point that he was bedridden for some time. It wasn't long before such a wild woman drew the eyes of many a man. With her father's new wealthy position, he was expected to find her a suitable match in marriage. Anne, however, had no interest in such a life, and instead pursued a young man by the name of James Bonny.
Her father got a plantation in South Carolina, and she moved out there. There she met a small-time pirate, not a very successful one, we believe. Bonny was his name, and she married him. So that's where the Anne Bonny came from.
With his reputation once again threatened, William forbade his daughter to marry James. Anne, however, didn't care for her father's orders, and under the cover of darkness, the pair fled. With nowhere else to go, the newlyweds made their way to an island in the Bahamas, said to be a new haven for sailors looking to make money on the high seas. Since the year of 1706, New Providence had a thriving nest of pirates. With global wars constantly changing rules of engagement, privateers operating in these waters finally decided to break off from their allegiances and form their own government. Now any ship could be victim to their ever-growing greed for plunder. While certainly lawless and wreathed in danger, this new republic was loosely held together by the Pirate Code, a set of rules enforcing a reasonable amount of civility in an otherwise cruel base of operation. It was here where Anne encountered the charming pirate Jack Rackham, more famously known as Calico Jack. Her feelings quickly transferred from James to Jack, and it wasn't long before she once again eloped. Dressing as a man, both for comfort and blending in with the crew, Anne began her profession for which her spirit so greatly yearned. The ferocious roar of cannon and musket fire cracked through the air. Wooden beams splinter and shred through men, leaving mortifying wounds. Screams of agony echo out as demonic figures leap onto deck, cutting down any who resist their warpath. The noise is deafening, and trembling fear is all that is left in those still standing. With a sword in one hand and a pistol in the other, Anne Bonny is among many who bring such destruction to any vessel that fails to surrender.
She was using her womanhood to her advantage. So, she would dress up as a man, she would jump aboard the boats they were attacking, and then supposedly she would flash the crew, she'd bare her breasts to them, and they were so, surprised by this that they would literally drop their weapons, they would be disarmed. And then she would use that to her advantage, and then she'd go and she'd attack them because they were, without their weapons. So she was a clever woman.
A pirate's intent is always to salvage as much cargo as possible from a target, and terror is best used against the poor and often young sailors. A reputation must still be held, and ships that refuse the chance of an unconditional surrender are met with barrages and raids that would make any soul beg for mercy. Stories of these hellish massacres spread quickly through taverns and encourages the immediate drop of resistance to any who sight the skull and bones flying out at sea. But not all were so easily swayed by fear. Jonathan Barnett, a well-seasoned pirate hunter, was given the task of tracking down, capturing and/or killing Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, and another female pirate, Mary Read. In October of 1720, Barnett was sailing around Jamaica when he spotted a ship anchored near Negril. When approaching it to inquire as to who they were, a swivel gun from the unknown vessel opened fire. The mysterious ship was the William, a small but fast sloop led by Jack, Anne, and Mary. After a recent plundering which scored them a large casket of rum, they took to sheltering near the coast, where they drank below deck, so heavily that most could barely stand. By the time of the encounter, only Anne, Mary, and a few others were fit to fight. Barnett boarded, and hand-to-hand combat ensued. Anne Bonny put up fierce resistance, even calling down to those below deck, demanding they join the fight. Despite her bravery, being heavily outnumbered, she eventually saw that there was no use in carrying on, and surrendered. The crew were taken to Spanish Town in Jamaica, where they were all sentenced to death by hanging. Anne and Mary, however, had one final card to play, as when they were sentenced, they pleaded the belly, a plea in which to stay an execution on account of pregnancy. The two female pirates were allowed to live until the time of their birthings, after which they would be quickly executed. As Jack awaited his turn on the hangman's knot, he asked the guards for one final request.
Jack had one last wish, and he was allowed to see Annie before he died. And when he met her, she used the infamous line, "I'm sorry, Jack, that it's come to this, but if you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't be hung like a dog," which is fairly brutal to say the least.
Shortly after, Jack was hanged and his body put on display at Port Royal. Mary caught a terrible fever and died soon after in prison. Anne, however, has no record of being executed and simply disappeared from history.
And then after that, she escapes into obscurity. The General History of the Pirates is published in 1724. He unfortunately says, "and we know no more of her." So there's various theories. So there's the main one that contends is that her father, who had given up the law and prospered and bought a plantation in the Carolinas, takes her back. But consider what Anne Bonny was in 1721. She was illegitimate. She was a notorious ex-pirate. She had an illegitimate child of her own. Would a prosperous plantation owner really have said, "Come in, my illegitimate ex-pirate daughter, with an illegitimate child of your own, come in, come in"? What would the neighbours have said?
There are many rumours as to what exactly her fate was, ranging from escaping and returning to piracy, to being bribed out by her father and living to an old age while having a family of her own. All that we do know is that in a world where men dominated the seas, Anne Bonny fought and plundered her way to notoriety as one of the most feared pirates in the world, and still managed to escape the hangman's knot, leaving her story's end up to wild speculation and imagination.
You could say it might be suggested that she did this or she did that, but who knows, I really don't know,
I think for some people, they would have seen her as a joke, maybe because, they wouldn't have taken the fact that she was a woman pirate seriously. And then there would have been other people who would have been in closer range to her, to actually would have, seen or heard from their friends or their family what she was actually like. And according to them, that she was a really fearsome fighter and she was someone that you do not mess with.
I think she deserves to be up there in the echelons of, of contribution to the whole story of piracy, along with Gráinne Whale and Grace O'Malley and her amazing tale of being an actual sea captain. and then Mary Read and Anne Bonny themselves, and into the later period of Jingji Sao, and one of the most successful, if not the most successful pirate, and she was a female in China, you know. So she certainly, when you start listing out the contribution of women at that time through the centuries from a maritime perspective, there's not that many. So she's certainly, I think that's where the pride comes in, that she's part of that level of historical value.